Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I'd especially like to thank the Georgetown School of Foreign Service for hosting this wonderful event. My name is Dave Buffalo. I'm a member of the Board of Directors for the Council for Emerging National Security Affairs. As you can see, we've got signs around here that say CENSA. It is CENSA, Council for Emerging National Security Affairs, not Mensa, which is very similar. It's an organization for the top 2% on the IQ test, but I mean, we're very similar to that. But CENSA is a nonprofit, nonpartisan 501c3 research organization that serves, whose mission is to help shape the policy debate through various fora. It serves as a mid-career professional organization that kind of bridges the gap between some of the younger organizations like Young Professionals in Foreign Policy and the older, more established organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations. Through its membership helps shape the policy debate through a number of different mediums. One is functions such as this, where we bring together esteemed academics to discuss some of the issues in foreign policy. Through routine publications, and we'll talk about those a little bit later, but CENSA usually publishes a lot of its members' work in a hardbound book that gets sent out to all of the War College faculties, the libraries, to a lot of the public policy institutions and schools. And then also, we've been hosting a routine dinner series that's been one of the highlights of my experience through CENSA. With that, we bring together in an intimate location setting, much more intimate than this actually, about somewhere between 20 and 40 mid-career professionals with a lot of senior foreign policy practitioners. Over the past 3 years, we've had people such as Undersecretary Michelle Flournoy, Representative Ike Skelton, Governor Tom Ridge, General Michael Hayden, Lieutenant General Brent Scowcroft, just to name a few of the people who willingly come and just had dinner with members of CENSA to share their thoughts, their experiences on helping shape policy, and to hear ours, to hear a younger view with some fresh ideas on the foreign policy debate. I encourage everybody to, on your seats there is a survey form. Please fill it out. We want to hear from you. We want to keep in contact with you. Not everything that we do is a member-only event, and there are a lot of opportunities for people to participate in CENSA events, although we absolutely encourage many people to apply for the membership program. Especially those, we've developed a relationship and offer somewhat of a trial membership with various different mid-career foreign policy organizations. So those like the White House Fellows, the JCS interns who are attending Georgetown and who go on to serve at the Pentagon, some of the CNAS, Next Generation Fellows, Truman Fellows, and things of that nature. If you qualify for any of those, then you are definitely more than welcome to participate in CENSA events during your fellowship here. With that, let me turn it over to Amy. Thanks. Thank you.
If you read the newspaper, and I know that you do, these are a few of the stories you might have seen in recent weeks. The Treasury Department identified an Uzbek citizen facilitating an al-Qaeda network in Iran, funneling money to al-Nusra Front in Syria. Even Iran, which officially supports the Assad regime and abhors al-Qaeda, may not have full understanding of this network operating within its borders. France publicly destroyed a stock of 3 tons of confiscated ivory from African elephant tusks. President Hollande said that the French action was designed to send a clear and precise message to poachers, traffickers, and buyers. 110 million customers at Target, possibly some of us, learned they were victims of a hacking incident. As a result, their personal information could right now be being sold at an illicit digital marketplace where commercial counterfeit credit cards and other personal information can all be had for a price. And the list easily goes on from there. That's just the last few weeks. There's the story of Indonesia's mercury imports, hundreds of times higher, in fact, than the official tally. And the one about the 4 baby selling rings recently broken up by the Chinese police, who then reclaimed 382 infants sold through these rings. Some of these news items are local, close to us. Others seem distant, challenging, exotic, alarming. But they are all stories about illicit economic activity, often conducted through transnational networks. Illicit networks are globally pervasive. They engage all of our public institutions, from law to politics to finances to culture. They pose tremendous challenges for policymakers and for those in the national security community seeking to untangle their sources and flows, which is why we are so lucky to have three illustrious speakers with us tonight to help us make sense of this complex landscape. You will notice that there is not a fourth. Douglas Farah got in touch with me late last night to say he was unavoidably held up in Central America doing this very thing. And he's really sorry. It had to do with the snowstorm and flights and the like. But I do have a few of his comments written down for this audience, and I will incorporate them as I can into our discussion in a few minutes. Here on the stage, in the flesh, are economist Dr. Gary Schiffman at the very end of our line. Gary, as you know, is a professor here at Georgetown. He's worn multiple hats in industry, the Department of Homeland Security, and elsewhere. I have been told that he is much loved as a professor here. What I didn't know until today was that the affection goes both ways. I learned that he himself was a security studies student, and he just couldn't stay away after he finished his PhD. Chip Poncy, as you know, sitting at the other end, was among those in the Treasury Department who innovated the use of financial tools as a way to combat illicit networks. But his modesty is so profound that the only way I could really figure out who this guy was in the pages of Juan Zarate's recent book, Treasury's War. And I can tell you what pages he's on, because he's actually indexed. Zarate was the first assistant secretary at the Office of Strategic Policy for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes. So I believe we should trust his remarks in his book that Chip had, and I quote, deep intellect, the charisma to get along with anyone, and the seeming energy of 5 men. This is not even including his recognition as one of the world's leading anti-money laundering experts. So we are expecting high energy. Our third speaker is Miklaucic, the director at the Center for Complex Operations at NDU, the National Defense University, and the editor of the books which you've been given tonight, Convergence. He is, among those things, also a keen observer of his surroundings, and I can confirm this by way of a brief discussion we had after his return from a conference on illegal trafficking in Germany last year. He detailed these discussions, the events, and the participants, but what really sort of struck me at the level of detail was his description of, I believe it was a Ukrainian, but someone from a CIS country, female border guard arriving as a participant wearing Christian Louboutin shoes. Now these, if you don't know, are very beautiful and very expensive women's shoes. And the little snapshot of this woman was a testament not only to Michael's powers of observation, but also to me a real distillation of the ironies of corruption and illicit networks, which seem also to frequently be just expressions of human desires. And finally, and then we'll get started, I really want to thank you who have all come out at the end of what I know is a long work day to join us. I have seen the RSVP lists for coming from you for this, and I know that many of you are already working in this area and have a high level of expertise on various parts of this topic. So I hope that afterward you'll stick around, you'll chat with CENSA, you'll chat with Georgetown, you will chat with our speakers, and most of all that you will chat with each other and have a few refreshments on us. We will talk among ourselves for another 15, 20 minutes, and then I will turn the rest of this discussion over to you. And we'll stop at about 7:30, 7:40, and you can continue the discussion with that. Sorry about that. So let's start just by kind of scoping this problem, that's okay? Could you help us understand the scope of this issue, illicit networks? What are they? How big are they, if that's the right measurement? And what kinds of measurement sort of tools or units do we use to say what they are? And I will let you sort out who speaks for it.
I defer to these two gentlemen to start. As the high energy person on the panel, sorry.
Well, okay, as the non-economist, although I am an economist, I just don't practice that particular dark skill anymore. It's like dark matter. You can't measure it outright. You're always measuring it by the way that it impacts other things. Seizures, that kind of thing. there are various estimates, but the estimates are not that helpful. The IMF consensus range for the money value of the illicit market is from 2 to 5% of global product. So we're talking about trillions of dollars. It's not insignificant, but it's just a very rough estimate. 2 to 5% is a significant margin of error.
So my observation is that I think the world is a network, right? I mean, humans are social beings, and so everything is a network. And I think we need to ask the question with that in mind a little bit differently. So an illicit network is a threat to us to the extent that it engages in illicit activities and that it has power, right? So the way in which I would measure a network is the way in which it can exercise power. We can proxy for power in simple ways like the number of nodes in a network, the size of a network. So the idea is that the power of the network is limited by the size of the network, or in economic terms, the wealth is limited by the size of the market. The larger the market that you have access to, the more wealth that you can generate. This is true of drug cartels. This is true of the United States economy. It's the same idea, same economic principles at stake here. The key idea is that we're realizing, and we're starting, because of technology, we're starting to map these illicit networks. But they've always been networks. It's just we're now coming to realize and think of them as networks.
Well, I do realize now some looseness in my question, because you've talked about the scope of damage or impact, and you have talked about the scope or size of networks. Is there even more that we should be considering? Or
For me, it's as a high energy person who's not necessarily intellectual, despite what Juan says, and let me just start by publicly announcing a disclaimer, which is that Juan and I are friends from childhood, basically. So whatever he has to say about me, you have to take with a grain of salt. Secondly, Amy, to thank you and not the Mensa but CENSA folks who have put this together. Appreciate the distinction, Dave. And you all for your interest. This is a field, and when I say this, I'm going to get to that in a minute, how we define it, that has exploded over the past 12 years that I've been involved in it. It's one of the few areas where someone with my background, which is to say someone that has not had any professional experience prior to 9/11 in combating illicit finance, was able to get to the front of the policies that have driven the field to a point where a school that wouldn't take me as a student, Georgetown School of Foreign Service, had me back as a professor. So I was really excited about that. And I tell that story often when I speak publicly about the field of illicit finance, which is one component of illicit networks that I want to talk about, because it's really important, particularly for public interest groups, to understand the still relatively new environment and the need for new thinking and contributions in this space that we are learning as we go. And now to answer your question, Amy, illicit networks, my perspective on this is from the Treasury Department, and it's from the perspective of trying to develop a set of policies that harness all the authorities, the expertise, the relationships, the experience that we have as a finance ministry or Treasury Department, as U.S. government, as an open society, as a capitalist economy that is largest in the world, as a money dollar clearing facility for global trade, into a comprehensive and effective set of actions against those that represent our priority threats in the national security landscape. And while that sounds fairly straightforward, I hope, implementing those policies and building those policies from a foundation of financial transparency is incredibly difficult, starting with defining this problem. So appreciate Michael pointing out that the variance in 2 to 5% from the UNODCP and the IMF has taken up is exactly the right starting point. While there's a wide margin for error in that 2 to 5%, what's important to recognize is when we define the size of this network by success, we could look at it through two different goalposts. We could say, on the one hand, when and where we have brought to bear the full power and focus of the US government with our relationships abroad and domestically with the private sector, we've been, I think, unequivocally effective. And I'll point to Iran and Al-Qaeda as examples, where, but for our illicit finance set of policies, we would be in a different posture with respect to combating Al-Qaeda or Iran. I think that's a non-controversial statement. On the other end of the spectrum, if you were to look at this in objective metrics and say, well, if the size of the problem defined as illicit finance is somewhere between 800 billion and 2 trillion, which is about the estimate that you keep seeing in the size of the global economy now, how much do you think we confiscate a year in an economy that represents about a fifth of global GDP? In an economy that's almost $17 trillion of annual productivity, we forfeit, as the best country in the world, less than $2 billion of illicit assets. When you look at the 2 to 5% range in that, you're talking upwards of $500 billion, and we get less than $2 billion, of which the majority or penalties are not actually illicit funds. So from that metric, the way we define it leaves a huge, huge opportunity for getting better. As good as we are, as effective as we may be on top national security threats, systematically, we're nowhere near scratching the surface. And this is why the newness of the field and the interest from you all is so important, because we clearly need to improve if we're systematically going to attack this in a more effective fashion.
And just to add to that, so we have these estimates. UNODC, the Treasury Department, they're wild guesses is what they are. We don't know. We have a sense of the regulated banking industry, and we have a sense of how the regulated banking industry looks, and we know that globally. But there's so much economic activity that we have no idea of the size, the scope, the direction of it. And when we do good things at the Treasury Department to go after certain ways in which people move money, there are substitutes and alternatives to those ways of moving money. And we see hawaladars and we see informal money transfer networks. The new challenge, the new opportunity that somebody in this audience is going to figure out is Bitcoin and cyber currencies. These things really, if you think that somebody in a building within 10 miles of here has all this figured out, they've got all the answers, they haven't told you what they are yet, that's not the case. Right? This is really, really complex stuff. So in disclosure, I've known Chip for many years, and he does have the energy of 10 people. And
frenetic, actually.
He's done amazing things with Juan and others, and I've spent my time in government as well, fighting these battles. But I think any effort that we place tonight on sizing the market might be just misleading.
Amy, I only have the energy of a half person. I know that I get tired. But I'd like to share one other observation. First of all, the story that is told in the book Treasury's War that involves you gentlemen is one of the great stories. It's one of the success stories of the decade of war that we've just emerged from. It's the story of discovering, not only is it a story of discovering an entirely new tool set to defend our national interest in a struggle, I would say an existential struggle, others disagree with me. But it's also a story of adaptability of an agency of the US government that was forced to innovate radically when half of its guts were cut out and put into the Department of Homeland Security. And I would say today that the Department of the Treasury is a full-fledged member of the national security community in a way that it wasn't prior to 9/11. But I want to put a different spin on the measurement issue, the issue of metrics. We tend immediately to go to quantitative metrics because that's how we measure almost everything in life. I want to do this anecdotally. In 2012, 2 men were indicted in the Federal Court of the Southern District of New York Mansour Ababsiar and another man whose name I forget, an Iranian. Mansour Ababsiar is an American of Iranian origin. The indictment was for conspiracy to assassinate the Saudi Arabian ambassador, just here in Georgetown, as a matter of fact, at a restaurant here in Georgetown. Ababsiar and his co-indictee, who is a member of the Quds Brigade in Iran, a member of the Iranian government, an official of the Iranian government, the two of them conspired to link up with a member of the Zetas, a Mexican crime and drug cartel that's very, very effective at getting stuff in and out of the United States. Fortunately, that conspiracy was caught. It was stung by the by the Drug Enforcement Agency. But imagine that had succeeded. We cannot depend on luck every time. The convergence of the Quds Brigade, Ababsiar in the United States, and possibly the Zetas in Mexico, conspiring to kill the Saudi ambassador in the United States. Okay, how do you measure that? How bad is that? Let me just remind you what was the trigger for World War I. It's not just an assassination in the United States. The knock-on effects of the assassination of the Saudi ambassador in Washington could have been cataclysmic. And we missed it by a hair. So that's just my take on how do you measure this. It's difficult to measure what didn't happen.
Well, let's go back then to what makes this so complex, right? Because we're sitting in a place where, I'm sorry, I'm afraid this is, we're sitting in a place where you've laid out some of the ways in which we can look at this and moved kind of very quickly into what the government's trying to do. But all of you have said in different ways, well, there's room for improvement, this is really, really complex. Can we talk about a few of the ways in which it's complex, and then we can turn back to sort of solutions, and I have some nice comments from Doug about that too. So one of the ways that people talk about the complexity, including, I think, very much in the financial sphere, is how deeply intertwined these illicit economies or the actors in these networks are with our everyday activities. Could you talk about that a little bit? Because it seems like one of those things that's so naughty. If it is something for which we should have almost zero tolerance, as you sort of suggest, Michael, it can't be the answer that we like lop off our regular economies. We don't have drastic capabilities like that at our disposal.
Nor would we want to, right? And sorry, I'm stepping in front on this one. And I think it's a seminal question, the complexity of this. I mean, on the one hand, what I tried to say at opening is, and I alluded to it, I didn't really state it, there's convergence of all illicit in many respects around finance. That's not entirely true, but it's largely true. At the end of the day, the activity of concern either relies upon or benefits from the financial system in a way that creates a need for illicit networks, and at the same time an opportunity for governments to exploit the financial system in a way that, from the governance side, helps us identify who the bad guys are and disrupt them in the financial system. And from the criminal perspective, is a conveyor belt for either extracting or repatriating profits or financing activity of concern. So the financial system becomes an immediate, essential intersection for all the activities that we really care about, whether criminal or national security threats or both. And that the premise to our effectiveness in understanding those threats and then taking actions to disrupt them is a degree of transparency in the system that allows us to disaggregate what you've just said, Amy, which is what is legitimate and okay, what is suspicious and worthy of investigation, and what is a red light that we need to get on right away. Is the traffic sufficiently complex that making that set of judgments, particularly on the fly with literally trillions of dollars revolving through the system on a daily basis, is the traffic sufficiently sophisticated to challenge our ability to do that? The answer is clearly yes. And I would start with the complexity of the financial system in the white space, in the legitimate economic and financial transactions that we rely upon and engage in every day as part of a global economy and global financial system. Since 2008, it's been a lot easier to say that. I can tell you, before 2008, it wasn't so easy. When you would explain to people, and I had this conversation, Gary, please hit me at some point, or you hit me, Amy, because this is me getting comfortable. But in the early days, it was interesting because there was a certain acceptance that the financial system understood fundamentally the parties with whom it was doing business, the transactions that it was facilitating or engaging in a manner that would allow us as policymakers to build upon that foundation of transparency to disaggregate what is interesting and what is suspicious and what is immediately an imminent threat from what is ordinary. And what we've learned, I think, over the past decade, and for those before me, well before this, is that challenge is much harder in practice than it is in concept. And the minute you start to probe a specific investigation or a financial product, it becomes almost self-evident in a way that still, I think, is a disconnect from the policy discussions versus the reality of implementation. Take a normal multinational corporate deal, whether transactional or relational, whether it's an acquisition, a merger, or a particularly interesting set of transactions that are cross-border. And what you'll find are complicated financial instruments, quite a bit of financial intermediation. A trade finance deal involves several parties of interest. You will find shell companies, holding companies. You will find service providers, all of which are essential and legitimate for transacting the engagement or opportunity at hand. Totally legitimate. And then if you look at that through an illicit lens, you say that's a cutout, that's a frontman, that's at least a problem. We don't know where the bottom of that one is, and that is by and large international finance these days. That's certainly trade finance, where we've migrated from this is trade finance, letters of credit, to this is trade finance, open account settlement of wire transfers that look just like a regular wire transfer, as it turns out it's a settlement of an account cross-border. It's gotten so sophisticated. Yes, please.
So it looks the same whether it's licit or illicit, with maybe a couple exceptions. That's how complicated it is. So your question is how complex is it? If I'm running a drug cartel, the only reason I need to move money is because money is a store of value. And I want that value somewhere to do something with it, so I'm going to have to move it, store it, and spend it, right? So I need to participate in some form of this, global financial system, right? If I'm running a licit kind of company, I have to do the exact same thing for the exact same reasons. So what are the differences? The differences are, if I'm running an illicit organization, I don't have recourse to the courts of law for breach of contract. I don't have recourse to law enforcement. But other than that, it's basically the same thing, right? So you modify the way in which you move money because you don't have recourse to the normal legal norms that you do if you're running a licit economy. But you're trying to do the same thing, your goals are the same thing, and you actually have to do the same thing. So it looks the same, and any money launderer worth their weight has legitimate businesses all over the place. So you do see legitimate businesses doing all of the things that Chip said, and they're interlinked with the illicit organization. And then we sit back here in Washington and we're trying to pull it apart. It's really, really hard.
I only have to add that it's not only complicated technically. I mean, there's a degree of moral ambiguity and ambivalence as well. One of the points that my co-author in this book, Moises Naim, makes in the book that we did, as well as in his real path-breaking book, Illicit, is that it's not just all about crooks and criminals. I mean, we're all, to some degree, compromised when we buy counterfeit cigarettes for people who, there is a difference, but not only are those who sell and make drugs involved in this, but the people who buy and use drugs are involved in it. I would also say that there's another element of technical complexity, which is that technology is leaping out so far ahead of law in some of these matters that some of the things that people are doing may not be illegal today. If any of you remember Napster, before it was illegal, it was legal. If any of you has ever, be careful here, Michael. There was a time, the drug ecstasy was made illegal in 1991. In 1990, it was a legal drug to use. Suddenly, it became an illegal drug. Every drug has a specific chemical signature. When a drug manufacturer discovers that his designer cocktail drug has been declared illegal by the Food and Drug Administration, he just changes a part of the signature. That new drug is not illegal until it is said that it's illegal. So that there are technical ambiguities as well as moral ambivalency involved.
I'm glad you brought that up, because now we have sort of both sides of this. There are, I've opened now 30 books on this topic in the last couple of weeks, and many are by anthropologists and people in development, and they start with the stories of individuals buying and selling cigarettes in places where you hope that they make those, that dollar that day. And along the way, I learned that over 3/4 of the cigarettes that are actually sold in this world are probably sold illegally, something like that. Or smuggled.
Significant amount.
Yeah.
So it's phenomenal. Let me ask you one more question, and then I really want this to be your discussion. And this isn't you might want to start with this about networks. So we've sort of talked about the illicit, but there have been illicit groups and illicit economic activity for a long time. Suddenly we're focused on, and there have even been networks in the sense of human, kinship or other organizations. But so why suddenly, get around this phrase, why is the network part of this important at this particular moment?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one I've thought about quite a bit, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, where analytics, right? So for those of you who are in government or work with the government, and analytics is sort of like a big thing right now, and everybody's focusing a lot on it. It used to be Microsoft Excel based, right? It was rows and columns, and you would look for outliers and things like that. But as I said earlier, the world is actually a network. The world is not rows and columns. Your life is a series of relationships or nodes and edges. And what's happened now is in the last 10 years, technology has brought into the analytic workforce this ability to take those rows and columns and show that diagram, right? And that diagram visually turns out to be really powerful and important. And I think a lot of our realization in sort of the national security community over the last 5 years or so have been driven by the technology to sit at an analyst's desk and to see the drug trafficker and who their relationships are, and who the facilitators are, and who's moving the money. And it's so much more intuitive to us, because that's actually the way we understand the world to be. I mean, it makes sense to us. Nobody has to explain to us the nodes and edges of the network, right? But you take somebody who's an Intel analyst with a great degree from Georgetown and no quantitative skills, and you give them an Excel spreadsheet, it's really hard to make sense of it. But we can actually make sense of it now. So the point that I would like folks to remember is that it's not that the world is now a network. It's that we're now understanding that the world has always been a network, and the complexity that we're talking about so far tonight is just being able to pull the network apart and find the bad stuff and the good stuff, and that's incredibly hard to do, and we haven't figured that out yet, right? So the call to action here is, how do we figure that out? If it's not a linear regression model, what is it? Right? And the answer is we don't know yet, but that's the work of the next decade, I think.
That's a fascinating answer. Did you want to add to that?
Sure. As always, I agree with what Gary has said. It's always wise to associate yourself with somebody that you know is brilliant in this space. I would start with why networks are important now. I suppose they've always been important in the way that Gary has answered. And it's an interesting way to look at it. I think perhaps they're more important now for a couple of reasons that are not unique to illicit. One is that you have now, everyone has said this, a shrinking planet. A more integrated, intermediated, sophisticated global economy and financial system than ever before. So most crudely, you could say, why do we care about guys drawing pictures in Tora Bora and caves in Afghanistan? Well, because they come up with plans to take down the 2 tallest buildings in the States, right? Pretty vivid, graphic example of the fact that the world has shrunk. And so local problems become global problems, and local solutions become global solutions in ways that I think historically weren't necessarily the case. That's legitimate and illegitimate, right? So the sophistication, the intermediation of the modern global economy makes it more and more important to understand specialists that can help you get through the traffic. And it doesn't matter if you're a legitimate businessman or you're an illicit person. You need people who can understand how best to move money. You need people who can understand how best to cross borders. You need people who can understand how best to navigate the modern trade environment, the bureaucracy, the red tape. Again, you could have a Fortune 500 conversation and sort of the airplane two, or not airplane, the Leslie Nielsen Naked Gun conversation with a round table of global jerks. They're going to have the same set of problems, which is how are we going to move product from here to here, and who's our guy to do this, right? The sophistication of the modern economy begs for that sort of specialization where you see a convergence, at least in the financial space, of what would otherwise be disparate actors. Michael, I think your example is a very good one, of who can we get to help us fulfill this particular need in our organization. When it comes to money, the sort of $60,000 question, which I guess is a $60 billion question now, at least if you're Madoff, is do we have professional money launderers or money movers who can help us defined as the drug trafficking organization, the fraudster, the extortion ring, the terrorist organization, the whatever it may be that is the problem, that has a financial need? Do we have people that can move the money for us in a way that gets the job done at an efficient rate and with a degree of security that we can rely on? That's a great question for illicit finance. And I can tell you, having been on the inside, that the answer is not immediately obvious. And I'll give you 2 different answers to that question. One is, if you look at the indictments that the U.S. has rendered against money launderers consistently over the past decade, call it 1,000 a year, which is about right. Well over 900, I think it's like 950 to 960, depending on your count, but 95 to 98% of these indictments are issued against individuals that are also indicted for predicate offenses. What does that mean? It means that either laundering is so easy that the people who sell the drugs or commit the fraud launder their own funds, or we're just so not good at finding the Kaiser Sose of money laundering that all we do is chase the predicate offender until they place the money, and then we whack them with an indictment on money laundering on top of or stacking a predicate charge. But the facts are the facts. 95-98% of our indictments in money laundering are also against guys that are committing the predicate offense. 2 ways to read that, and I have heard both sides of it ad nauseum. It's because Kaiser Sose and money laundering doesn't exist. These sort of, white knights of illicit finance are a myth. They don't really exist because it's too easy to launder your own stuff, and it's too hard to find that mystical guy, so you just place it yourself. And I've heard the other side, which is, why do you think we only get $1 billion of this? It's because we're missing 99.9% of the elephant in the room, which are the guys that are so good that they escape detection.
Can we take the vote, Chip?
And they're both credible, right? I mean, they're both reasonable responses. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But I say that because I think when you ask, why is this complicated? What does this look like? How do we attack this? And ultimately, what are the solutions? That this sort of perspective lends, hopefully, some visibility into how much we don't know and how much opportunity we have to be disruptive over networks that, without a doubt, whether you believe in the predicate offenders can just launder their own stuff or not, you still need specialists to move money in ways that at least are addressing the primary concerns that we face by volume or by threat. And that is what creates these networks. So I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it's a well-intentioned, and we'll see if it's effective, convergence of policy across the illicit finance spectrum. It started as AML, right, from the 80s, 90s. After 9/11 became terrorism finance CFT, so AML became AML CFT. And then we added the Iran stuff and the rogue regime stuff, so AML, CFT, and WNDPF, like we love acronyms, WND Proliferation Finance. And now a corruption return to drug trafficking, ironically, which is where the whole thing started, with the transnational organized crime. But you're seeing convergence of all this, you add tax to the mix, and the underlying premise is that at the end of the day, it is a certain degree of financial specialization that we need to attack, which specialization is aiming to defeat our safeguards and controls through anonymity, through opacity, that prevents us from where we started, which is disaggregating what is okay and what is not okay. And what I'll leave you with, and I know I'm talking way too much, is that challenge, as simple as it sounds, which is how do we enhance financial transparency? The minute you start to really wrestle with it, becomes, again, infinitely more complicated. How do you deal with shell accounts? We need them, and yet they're abused. How do you deal with service providers like attorneys and accountants? We need them, and yet they're abused. How do you deal with correspondent banking? It's the neuron connectivity of the financial system, and yet it is through which all this junk flows, right? How do you deal with financial inclusion of disenfranchised interests that we want to bring into the system, and yet have adequate safeguards on industries like money source businesses that don't even have any federal functional regulation over them? These are the challenges that we're facing, and they're challenges that are fundamental to financial transparency. Before we even get to the cool stuff of targeting and putting networks together, just having an assurance that at the end of the day, we have some confidence that we understand where money's coming from, who's dealing with it, and where it's going, that allows us to then have the platforms to do the cool stuff. We're still struggling with that premise, I think.
If I may, if the question is why are these networks important now, I would say it's specifically these networks, not all networks, which have been with us forever, as has been pointed out. And in fact, illicit networks have been with us from time immemorial. The Bible tells stories that can be interpreted as illicit networks. What makes it particularly salient today, what in my mind makes it a national security threat, is the convergence of vast amounts, unprecedented amounts of capital generated by arms sales, drug sales, human trafficking, just phenomenal amounts of money, with a highly accelerated degree of connectivity around the world. People can connect from Mexico City to Jakarta, as you well know, by texting each other, with anonymity in many cases, and the democratization of lethal technology. It used to be that only countries, only states, had sufficient capital to create weapons of mass destruction. If you'll remember back to even my history books, the Manhattan Project took many, many, many hundreds of thousands of people and many, many billions of dollars. Now, lethal technology can be generated in a kitchen, in a tiny laboratory in a jungle. And I'm not just talking about drugs here, I'm talking about chemical and biological warfare agents. 2 Russian scientists published 10 years ago a formula for creating a highly resistant and highly contagious version of smallpox. It's there for any high schooler to take down and try to manufacture. So it's that combination of lethality, connectivity, and capital that makes these networks particularly salient to our national security today. And I'll just, if I may, I'm going to read one very brief sentence from the assessment of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, just published yesterday in the 2014 Quadrennial Defense Review. It's in his final statement. He says, "My greatest concern is that we will not innovate quickly enough or deeply enough to be prepared for the future, for the world we will face 2 decades from now." 2 decades from now. The networks that we're talking about are highly adaptive. Now, 20 years ago, John Arquila said it takes a network to beat a network. I asked him recently, what the hell does that mean? I work for a government. This is an asymmetric struggle against highly adaptive adversaries with weapons that are existential in their threat to us. And I too am worried. I have 4 children. Some of you are students, some of you I can tell are not students, but some of you are students. That world is your world 2 decades from now. I still got 1 good decade in me probably. That's the world you will inherit. And I just want to point out that in the year 474, Rome still ruled Southern Europe. 20 years later, the Visigoths razed Rome to the ground. In 1919, we thought the worst was behind us. The war to end all wars was behind us. In 1939, 20 years later, World War II broke out. And 20 years ago today, okay, it was just before the Rwanda genocide, but we thought we had left the Cold War behind us. And that's why I think these networks are very important in national security today.
What intriguing answers. Well, let's turn it over to you then. You've given us so much to think about, and yet we've kind of almost not scratched the surface in terms of some of the topics, potentially. So maybe you'll bring them up. If you'd like, there's a microphone on the side of the room. It would be, which would be great if you, just because we can hear you, if you would use it. If you really don't want to, then you can stand up there. And just give us your name, and you can direct your question if you'd like or not.
Yeah, thank you very much, actually. Very, very interesting. My name is Ghassan Shibli. I work for the UN Somalia and Eritrea Monitoring Group, and the sanctions actually investigated Al-Shabaab financing. The question here is, how do we encourage our allies and partners, whatever, in the Middle East and Africa to enforce and to help us to identify these networks? When I worked on Al-Shabaab, I found that increasingly they're using a sort of commodity-based money laundering operations. So we don't see any more movement of cash, of money between the Middle East and Africa. What we're seeing is a lot of movement of trade. So they're shipping some stuff, exchanging it, adding money to it, and bringing back stuff to Africa and generating a lot of funds. It's a charcoal trade, it's all this together. We went to the Middle East, and we couldn't investigate. They just shut down the doors. So we couldn't look there, and we couldn't identify those companies who are behind them, what are their networks. So here the question is, how do we enforce it, or how do we encourage those countries to cooperate? But at the same time, we have a lot of challenges, for example, in Africa, where we don't have financial institutions, and we don't have enforcement institutions. So we can create laws here, we can monitor here everything we want, but we will lose a lot that's happening outside our house. But this is where terrorists are growing and all this. So this is a question here on the macro. Yes, thank you.
So I got chips out.
Okay, so I think you in part have outlined the answer to your question. I appreciate it, but you've sketched out certainly the challenges that we face, right? So in the theater of operation of concern, fundamental challenges of rule of law, fundamental challenges of accountability, authority, even counterparty identification, to a point where even take it, one step more fundamental than disrupting Shabab financing, just providing humanitarian relief in Somalia, just trying to do the right thing, is full of potholes that anybody who's interested can read about the travesty of trying to finance humanitarian relief in that part of the world for decades, and most recently because of Shabab. I don't know that there's a lot we can do to affect that. I do think that it is important to recognize that if we can't, there are going to be limitations on what we can do, and that should impact our tolerance for risk in a way that I'm not sure is happening. So if you have a zero tolerance policy in an environment where you know there's going to be substantial risk, you just admitted we can't solve the problem, right, as a policy community. Or we go back to the table and say, you know what, there's going to be a heightened degree of risk that we either accept to try to affect this, or that we come up with new ways to mitigate that we haven't really identified on the ground. Intermediaries. You mentioned trade. Most of the trade that I'm familiar with that comes into the Gulf, that comes into Somalia, is from the Gulf. And that is the intersection of finance and trade. So wires come into finance, trade that goes out. The problem there, to sort of defend the Gulf, if we were to say the same thing about the U.S. and Mexico, and ask the Bank of the United States, which I won't use Bank of America because that's a real bank, but any of our primary dollar clearing banks about disaggregating their clearance and settlement of trade with Mexico from other trades, and then within Mexico, sole proprietors and small shops that are fundamental to the Mexican economy as they are here, from those that look like small proprietors but are in fact just trade-based money laundering fronts. They would say, how are we supposed to do this? That's the answer we're going to get from the Dubais, from the Qatars, from the other financial hubs where we see this trafficking happening. So that's the intermediary challenge. I think there, unlike in the sort of theater of operation space, there are steps that we can take, but those steps are going to require a degree of commitment that has been lacking, not just from, frankly, the intermediaries themselves, but from all of us. And then you get to the real issue, which is prioritization. If the dashboard can only hold 10 lights at a time, and you could look at those countries in the intermediary zone and say, okay, here's what we've got going on. We've got a legacy of fundamentalism and extremism that is financing our continued top national security threats in the form of al-Qaeda franchises that we're worried about. Where are you on that? We have a devolution, if we can call it that, in Afghanistan as we withdraw, and a real concern about everything from corruption to drug trafficking to terrorism financing that's also being settled in that part of the world. What are we doing about that? We have a new raging internal conflict in Syria that is implicating that entire region. What are we doing about that? By the way, Lebanon continues to somehow survive. What are we doing about the various groups there and the Hezbollah question? Did I mention Iran and how important that is to us? I mean, at some point, you run out of talking points, right? I mean, it's sort of, it's almost comical, except that it's tragic, right? Because something like Somalia doesn't ever get to the top of the list until there's a disaster, which happens from time to time, and then it's at the top of the list and it falls down. And so you say, well, this is unacceptable. We need to change this, which is the right response. But these are the challenges that we're facing, from on-the-ground theater of operations to intermediaries who are not trying to be part of the problem, they want to be part of the solution too, to those that are sort of the vanguards of policy, whether that's ourselves or manifestations of ourselves and agencies or allies, where there's too many lights on the dashboard, and there isn't, in my view, a systematic approach to attacking these problems through convergence of where does all this fundamentally come together? It's financial transparency. What are we doing to understand the sources of funds and the ultimate recipients of transactions, whether in New York or in Dubai, where we're talking about a high-risk industry like charcoal, or the garment district in New York, or other industries, or cigarettes, or used cars. What are we doing to demand from our financial institutions globally a degree of transparency that at the moment we can't seem to penetrate?
What about other tools in addition to financial, right, to sort of trying to finance? I know that there are two people here who are particularly expert in finance, but I mean, perhaps this question sort of leads down other paths, is it not? Also about development or about other activities of government, about trust, about, and I'm sure that that's a rabbit hole too, about development itself and what kind of conditions you want on the ground to create.
Are you asking us or them?
I'm open, I'm having a discussion.
Actually, full disclosure, I'm still to this day an employee of the U.S. Agency for International Development, although I haven't set foot in the Reagan building in 10 years. But let me make a claim to having some knowledge of development. I don't think the classic phrase in the military for the elements of national power are encapsulated in the DIME acronym. Diplomatic, information, military, and economic. The economic, if you include development in that, it becomes a little bit confusing. Development is not the same kind of thing as finance tools that you gentlemen are talking. Development is a long-term process, extremely long-term process, much longer-term process than people, even in the World Bank or USAID or the UN Development Program, are willing to admit. In their hearts, they realize that it's generational, it's deep structure, and The problem is that we've got different clocks going at the same time. The clock that I'm hearing ticking is ticking much faster than the development clock ticks. I don't think development is a short or midterm response to the problems that we've been describing here, posed by illicit networks and their convergence against our national security. Regrettably, because development feels good when you succeed, which isn't very often. But it takes a much longer time, and I think that the threat is imminent. It's not a threat in 20 or 30 years, it's a threat in 5 or 10 years. So I would not agree with my aid brethren who say development is the solution to this problem. In the long term, maybe. In the short and midterm, it is certainly not.
Can we have multiple tracks though? Because I think I entirely agree, Michael, with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
What I didn't finish, and typically too long-winded, I'm setting up a depressing picture, and I realize that. We're actually pretty good at trying to construct strategies that give us some quick wins and longer-term hope for changing the underlying dynamics. And development is the long-term horizon without a doubt. One of the challenges we have is integrating that into a meaningful long-term strategy with the other instruments of national power, and that's chronic. Short-term, yes, beyond finance, Amy, you're absolutely right. Intelligence communities have to be brought to bear to give us help in figuring out where should we be focusing our attention. The law enforcement community is viewed as a monolith. It's the furthest thing from it. I think understanding where the border authorities have leverage, information, relationships that can be brought to bear, where your more specialized financial investigators can be brought to bear, where your sort of army of resources, in our case would be the FBI, where you just drop them down and you've got blanket coverage. Integrating these different assets across what are seen as sort of monoliths. This is law enforcement, I see, there are specialists in there in a way that gives us the benefit of each of those communities to contribute to how we, short term, find the immediate actors of concern. Medium term, try to set up some institutional protocols with allies that are a longer term part of the solution. Long term, change the fundamentals on the ground, which is financial transparency in the financial system and theaters of operation, rule of law, and fundamental governance. Those are all complementary, they're not contradictory. It's just competing for attention, and we should do a better job of making space for that.
Sorry,
You want to respond quickly and then let's get another question,
quick comment.
please.
Sorry for that. Just to add on your point on development. One of the problems we face in Somalia and actually in Africa, the development community usually they don't understand the security threat. They don't see it. They don't appreciate it actually. And one of the issues is how can we come and discuss security issues with the development community and tell them like, you can't use this tool, you can't use this technology like you want, like spending the money without really doing some background check, talking to the citizens just there. So yes, there is a big problem of communication between both communities actually. Just wanted to stress this, and we lived it in Africa actually, so it's a big issue.
Thank you for your question. Yes, please.
My name is Steve Hirsch. I'm a journalist. I have a two-part question. First part is, you've talked a large amount about financial networks. The first part of my question is, what are the newly developing illicit networks or changes in illicit networks that U.S. policymakers should be looking at, and are they doing so? The second part of my question is, really gets a little bit to the root of this, which is the issue illicit networks, or like terrorism, is it, the networks are merely a symptom of the larger problem. If networks are being used by human traffickers, is it a mistake to be concentrating on networks when you should be concentrating on traffickers, terrorists, drug dealers, illegal cigarette makers, the like?
So let me take at least the first part of that, because this is something that I think about quite a bit. What I think we're missing right now is the interconnectedness of the different domains. So Pablo Escobar became the largest drug trafficker in the world, and he blew up an airliner and killed people, so he was like the narco-terrorist. And I think now what we've got is we've got this world, for a lot of the reasons that Chip and Michael talked about, where a drug trafficker is going to have illicit businesses to launder money, is going to support terrorist activities where that's appropriate, might engage in what we might consider insurgent activities. And to them, this is sort of normal business. And we're not prepared for that in the US government, because we have the Defense Department and Special Operations Command who have a mission, and we have the DEA who has a mission, and we have ATFC who has a mission, we have the Treasury Department who has a mission, we have US Customs and Border Protection which has a mission. And we like to see on the institutional side of the US government, we like to see the problem consistent with our authorities. And so we're constrained. The bad guys aren't constrained that way. Right? They'll sell drugs to make money, to buy guns, to attack a government building. Right? So who owns that problem? Is that an ATF problem or a DEA problem? So I think we're screwing that up pretty big time right now. Right? And I think we've got to get our arms around that. And that's a hard thing to do. That's institutional change that's going to take a while. But I think if I had one wish, right? It would be that we realize that and we start making and engaging in institutional reforms.
Are there more questions? Shall we go on?
Bring another question, because I want to think about your question
Okay.
before
Go
I...
back to it.
Let me just provide a brief, for me, answer to both your questions, which I think are great. Focus on finance. Are there other networks of concern? What are we doing to monitor and adapt, as I understand it? It's sort of a two-layer game, right? I mean, if finance is ultimately, it's a need for the bad guys, and it's an opportunity or vulnerability for us. It morphs. As we make moves, they make moves. So, example, Iran and the financial constriction we put around them, right? No dollar, no euro, no reserve currency, no hard currency, gold, right? So we moved to exchange house advisories, implicating Lebanon and neighbors, UAE and others, and saying, okay, now we're watching commodity-based value movements to try to get hard currency in. These games go on. And I do think you're right to say, is it about finance? And if so, are we being mindful of the adaptability, which you said, Michael, of these networks? We are. Are we good at it? I think it depends on the prioritization of the threat. But that capability certainly exists in the bad guy arena, and that capability to track and trace and follow it exists in the good guy arena. And where we're focused, I think we're generally good at it. Networks that feed into that is beyond my expertise, but I rely on the fundamental assumption that the networks that we're most concerned about do require financing or repatriation of profits in a way that will give us what we need through finance if we're effective. It's a partial answer. Networks as a proxy for sort of underlying demand is sort of how I saw your second question. Great, fascinating question, particularly in the drug context. That's always sort of a great social question. Is it demand problem, supply problem? And it is, I think, from the perspective of counter-illicit finance policy, something that we have rightly, in my view, acknowledged through the admission that an effective counter-illicit finance policy is increasingly necessary to being effective in disrupting the actors of concern, but it is far from sufficient. So Iran's not going to stop building nuclear weapons on account of the counter-illicit finance policy. It's counter-illicit finance is a component of a broader strategy. It's going to involve other components, right? Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah and Hamas and others aren't going to stop because of our counter-terrorist financing policy, but it's a key part of the counterterrorism policy. And integrating a counter-illicit finance component into a broader strategy that has, at its outset, very clear objectives of what do we want, how does a financial component fit into that, and then execute. And often, I think you're right, and I'm sort of implying here behind your question, that we don't ask ourselves enough the context of what is the broader mission, how does finance fit in, how does a counter-illicit finance agenda help us address that need? And what else do we need to bring to the table to make sure that this works? Because the idea of saying, Russia bad, sanctions, that doesn't make any sense. It's, well, what exactly is bad about Russia? What exactly are we trying to accomplish? And what are the financial instruments, authorities, and leverage that we can bring to bear to that mission? That's a better way to ask that question, which is now being debated literally by the hour in the press, right? But again, people want to jump to, this is bad, so sanctions. Well, that doesn't make any sense. So I appreciate your question, because I think it's important anytime people talk about financial policy of interdiction, disruption, and counterfeit finance, that it's put into that context, or it won't work, it won't be understood.
Let's get one more question in. And sorry to leap in.
In the rear back here.
Well, I'm so sorry. Look, this is what's going to happen. We're going to have one more question from the one person I saw before that. But then we're going to hang out and have some wine and hors d'oeuvres for an hour. You are going to have an opportunity to or stand up straight and the like.
And I love hors d'oeuvres and wine, so I will be here all night.
So please do continue to ask your questions as we move into a different phase of this. But
thank you very much.
My
name is Nathan Slaughter. I'm a security studies graduate student here. My grandfather, God rest his soul, told me when I was young, don't worry about trying to get a specific job. Passionately study and learn about what you're interested in, because odds are that job you retire with doesn't exist yet. To that point, the statement you made earlier, it takes a network to defeat a network, presents a massive challenge for the U.S. national security apparatus, which has been touched on by Dr. Schiffman in the class I had with him and also by him here tonight. How do we get our desperate agencies in a world of shrinking budgets to do more with less, to innovate, to adapt, cooperate, and evolve out of an "it's not my lane" mentality? What does the future national security practitioner look like?
Wow, there goes that hour.
That's a bigger question than I have an answer. But let me just first disabuse one notion, that the idea that you're going to have to do more with less, that's a lie. With less, you do less. Simple as that. So you can say it to your future bosses. You can say you're going to do more with less, but you have to know in your mind, I'm going to do less with less. So what am I going to focus on? I think the future national security professional had certainly better understand all of the tools of national power. The national security professional of 1980, when I studied at SAIS, was a guy who knew how many anti-ballistic missiles we had, how many ballistic ICBMs we had, how many subs we had, etc. How many troops we had to hold off the Soviets coming over the Fulda Gap. The national security professional today, all you have to do is read joint publication 3-24 on counterinsurgency. National security professional has to be an anthropologist, a sociologist, a psychologist, multilingual, has to understand economics, and be able to drink tea with the locals. It's a really the national security threats of the present and future are human threats, for the most part. There are non-human threats too. The climate is threatening, but the national security professional of the future has to understand human beings. Whatever you study, it's human interactions that you have to understand the most. I'm sorry, that's the best answer that I have.
Thank you.
Perfect.
It's a very nice note, if I can, for us to stop on. I mean, nice in the sense of continuing to contemplate the human complexities of this. Thank you so much for sort of outlining, beginning to walk us into what really was a very sophisticated discussion of illicit networks. Please do stick around, have some food, continue to ask questions. There are some folks here from CENSA. We would love to talk to you about membership. And just before anything else, let me thank our partners, Georgetown Security Studies Program, the Deputy Director, Dave Maxwell, who sort of said, yeah, we should do this, and possibly above all, Andrea Clabo, the Director of Programming, and her team of Shane and Jessica and volunteers who have been tweeting this whole thing and setting up chairs and doing all the stuff that made this really easy for the rest of us. Please fill out your surveys. There should be pens on or pencils on your seats, and leave them for us and we'll get them from you. Thanks so much.
Yes, the food and the wine is not quite free. It will cost you one of these surveys.